The lamination on these croissants lacks the precision our wholesale clients expect, Isabel. They're placing $1,000 weekly orders based on our reputation for excellence, my bakery owner said, dismissing my work in front of hotel purchasing managers. The clients looked uncertain, reconsidering their confidence in our pastry quality. My partner, Christopher Bennett, smiled warmly and held up one of my perfectly laminated croissants with practiced authority. Let me explain the innovative technique I developed for achieving this exceptional honeycomb structure and buttery flavor that has made our bakery famous among Manhattan's finest hotels. I stood at my pastry station in our Soho bakery, watching Christopher present pastry work that was unmistakably mine. The croissant lamination technique was mine, perfected through years of training in Paris and thousands of hours practicing the precise folding, resting, and rolling required for flaky layers. The cultured butter sourcing from a small Vermont dairy was mine, discovered through months of testing different fats to find one with perfect flavor and plasticity for lamination. The specific proofing temperature and timing that produced croissants with ideal rise and texture was mine, developed through countless batches and meticulous documentation. Even the understanding of how humidity, temperature, and dough hydration affected final quality came from classical French training I'd received at École Ferrandi. This was the 21st time in 2 years that Christopher had stolen credit for my pastry creations and positioned himself as the master pâtissier despite contributing almost nothing to actual recipe development or pastry technique. I'd documented every instance meticulously, building comprehensive evidence. I'd gathered proof through dated recipe notebooks showing my development process, time-stamped photographs of desserts during creation, competition entry forms listing me as creator, and pastry assistant testimony confirming I'd developed every technique Christopher claimed as his innovation. Because what neither Christopher nor these hotel clients knew was that I'd already secured written commitments from our 5 largest wholesale accounts to transfer their business to my independent patisserie. I'd obtained signed statements from my pastry assistants confirming Christopher's systematic credit theft. I'd been approached by 3 major bakery investment groups about backing my own establishment. I'd also consulted extensively with culinary attorneys who confirmed Christopher had violated partnership agreements and intellectual property protections through his fraudulent misrepresentation of my creative pastry work. In exactly 72 hours, I would confront Christopher during the James Beard Foundation pastry competition where I was competing as a finalist, revealing publicly that he'd been claiming credit for my pastry innovations while I actually created every dessert that made our bakery successful. His reputation would collapse when the pastry community learned he'd built his success on stolen recipes. My patisserie would launch successfully with the wholesale clients and investors who valued my actual pastry expertise. Before we witness how a talented pastry chef whose recipes were stolen used documentation and client loyalty to destroy her fraudulent partner while building her own award-winning patisserie, I want to thank you for being part of this community. A community that believes culinary fraud deserves serious consequences. A community that understands stolen recipe credit should be exposed and punished. If you've had your pastry recipes stolen by partners, if you've watched bakery owners claim credit for desserts you created, if you've been the invisible pâtissier behind someone else's success while they collected awards and media recognition, this story will resonate deeply. Hit that subscribe button to join thousands who appreciate stories where documentation and determination overcome exploitation. Now let's step into the world of French pastry where a brilliant pastry chef's recipes were systematically stolen by her bakery owner partner. Where bakery hierarchies enabled ongoing fraud. Where 2 years of careful preparation created the foundation for complete exposure and justice. My name is Isabel Morrison, though everyone calls me Bella. I'm a 32-year-old pastry chef originally from Portland, Maine. I grew up in a family where baking was both art and daily practice. My mother, Anne, was a home baker who made everything from scratch: bread, cakes, cookies, pies that neighbors requested for special occasions. My father, Thomas, owned a small cafe where my mother's baked goods were the main attraction. I was surrounded from childhood by the intoxicating aromas of butter, vanilla, caramelizing sugar, and yeast dough rising. Growing up in my mother's kitchen, I learned that pastry demanded precision unlike any other cooking. Savory cooking allowed improvisation and adjustment, but pastry required exact measurements, specific temperatures, proper timing. A cake with too much flour was dry and dense. Cookies baked 30 seconds too long were hard instead of chewy. Pie dough overworked became tough rather than flaky. Those lessons about precision became foundational to my pastry philosophy. I made my first batch of chocolate chip cookies when I was 6, standing on a step stool to reach the counter while my mother guided my hands measuring flour and sugar. The satisfaction of watching those cookies emerge from the oven, perfectly golden with melted chocolate, was magical. I was immediately hooked on the transformation that happened in the oven, how combining simple ingredients with proper technique created something delicious and beautiful. By age 10, I could make basic cakes, cookies, and simple pies. My mother taught me about ingredient quality, how real butter tasted different from margarine, how pure vanilla extract created depth that artificial flavoring couldn't match, how using good chocolate mattered enormously in final flavor. She emphasized that excellent pastry started with excellent ingredients combined with proper technique. My most profound early baking memory happened when I was 14. My mother was preparing a layered birthday cake for my father. Chocolate genoise soaked with espresso syrup, filled with chocolate mousse, covered with dark chocolate ganache. She let me help with every component. We made the genoise, carefully folding flour into whipped eggs and butter to maintain airiness. We prepared the mousse, tempering chocolate and folding in whipped cream for silky lightness. We made the ganache, combining chocolate and cream in perfect proportions for glossy, smooth coating. When the finished cake emerged from the refrigerator after setting overnight, covered in mirror-smooth ganache with delicate chocolate decorations, I understood that pastry wasn't just baking, it was craftsmanship. The cake was beautiful, precisely executed, technically excellent. More importantly, it was delicious, with each component contributing to a harmonious whole. That's when I knew I wanted to be a pastry chef, someone who created experiences through precisely crafted desserts. My parents initially worried about the demanding pastry profession. They knew the early morning hours, the physical exhaustion, the intense pressure, and the difficulty of making a living in professional kitchens. They encouraged me to go to college first, have a backup plan. But they also saw my passion and knew that trying to redirect it would be futile. When I was 16, I started working weekends at a local bakery, arriving at 4 a.m. to help with morning bread and pastry production. I learned about production baking, the batch sizes, the timing required to have fresh product ready when the shop opened, the consistency needed to produce identical items repeatedly. I also learned about the physical demands, standing for hours, working with hot ovens, the repetitive motions that made shoulders and backs ache. But I loved it. I loved the quiet early morning hours when the bakery was just the bakers and the ovens. I loved the smell of bread baking and butter melting. I loved seeing racks of croissants emerge perfectly golden, watching cakes rise into domed perfection, pulling cookies from the oven at exactly the right moment for chewy centers. That early experience confirmed that professional pastry was what I wanted despite the challenges. After high school, I attended culinary school in Boston focusing on pastry arts. The program taught classical French pastry technique, pâte choux for eclairs and cream puffs, puff pastry for millefeuille, various tart doughs, cake batters, custards and creams, chocolate work, sugar work, and fundamental decorating skills. The training was rigorous and demanding, with instructors who expected perfection and had no patience for sloppiness or imprecision. I learned to make perfect pâte choux, the delicate dough that puffed into light, hollow shells for filling. The technique required understanding how eggs, butter, flour, and water interacted, how proper stirring developed the right consistency, how oven temperature affected puffing. Too much egg and the dough was loose and didn't puff properly. Too little and it was dense. The baking had to start hot to create steam for puffing, then lower to dry the shells without burning them. I mastered puff pastry, the labor-intensive laminated dough that created hundreds of buttery layers. Making puff pastry required incorporating butter into dough, then folding and rolling repeatedly to create alternating layers of butter and dough. When baked, water in the butter created steam that separated the layers, producing flaky pastry that shattered delicately. The process was demanding. The butter had to stay cold enough to remain distinct but pliable enough to roll without breaking. The dough needed proper resting between folds. Temperature control was critical throughout. During my second year, I became obsessed with French pastry traditions and decided I needed to train in France to truly master classical technique. I researched French pastry schools and applied to École Ferrandi in Paris, one of the most prestigious culinary institutions in France, known for producing pastry chefs who worked in Michelin-starred restaurants and renowned patisseries. Getting accepted to École Ferrandi was thrilling and terrifying. The program was conducted entirely in French, which I'd studied in high school and college but wasn't fluent in. The standards were exacting, with French chef instructors who'd trained under legendary pâtissiers and expected students to achieve professional-level precision. I knew it would be difficult, but I was determined. Moving to Paris at 23 to attend École Ferrandi changed my life completely and set me on the path to becoming the pastry chef I am today. The program was intensely demanding, combining rigorous technical instruction with practical application in the school's professional pastry kitchen that operated like a working patisserie. We learned classical French desserts that form the foundation of all fine pastry: eclairs, religieuses, Paris-Brest, millefeuille, Saint-Honoré, opera cake, elaborate entremet compositions, macarons, and viennoiserie like croissants and pain au chocolat. The training emphasized precision and consistency above everything else. Every macaron had to be identical in size, with shells measuring exactly the same diameter and height. Every eclair needed to be perfectly piped with smooth, even lines and no air pockets. Every croissant required the exact honeycomb interior structure showing proper lamination with visible distinct layers. Instructors would fail entire batches if they didn't meet standards, requiring complete reproduction from scratch. There were no partial credits or allowances for close enough. In France, customers expect perfection every single time, my instructor Chef Dubois would say repeatedly, drilling this into us. One mediocre croissant and they never return to your patisserie. They tell their friends your quality is inconsistent. Excellence must be consistent and reliable, not occasional and lucky. You must be able to produce perfection repeatedly, under pressure, early in the morning when you're exhausted. That is what it means to be a professional pâtissier. I learned about French ingredient standards and why they mattered enormously for authentic results. French flour, designated type 45 or type 55, had different protein content and gluten structure than American all-purpose flour, affecting how doughs behaved during mixing, resting, and baking. French butter had minimum 82% fat content, significantly higher than standard American butter's 80%, which meant French pastries had richer flavor and better texture. The butter quality particularly mattered for laminated doughs like croissants and puff pastry. Higher fat content meant less water, which produced crisper layers and prevented sogginess. French butter also had cultured fermented flavor that added complexity American sweet cream butter lacked. I learned to identify butter quality by smell, taste, and how it handled during lamination. French chocolate had different formulations than American chocolate, with stricter regulations about cocoa content and permissible additives. Dark chocolate contained higher cocoa percentages and less sugar. The tempering properties differed, affecting how chocolate set and developed glossy surfaces. Even sugar had characteristics that mattered. French castor sugar dissolved more smoothly in meringues than coarser American granulated sugar. Understanding these ingredients and how to work with them was essential for creating authentic French pastry. I couldn't simply translate recipes using American ingredients and expect identical results. I needed to understand what each ingredient contributed and how substitutions would affect final products. That knowledge became crucial later when sourcing ingredients in America for my patisserie. The École Ferrandi curriculum was organized around classical French pastry categories, each requiring weeks of intensive practice. We started with basic doughs: pâte sucrée for tart shells, pâte brisée for savory applications, pâte sablée for more delicate cookies and tart shells. Each dough had specific mixing methods, ratios, and handling requirements. Overworking pâte sucrée developed too much gluten, making it tough rather than tender. Pâte sablée needed even more gentle handling to maintain its sandy, crumbly texture. We progressed to pâte à choux, the foundation for eclairs, cream puffs, and Paris Brest. Making proper choux required understanding how the cooking process gelatinized the flour, how eggs provided structure and moisture, how steam created the hollow interiors. The dough consistency needed to be exact: too stiff and it wouldn't puff properly, too loose and it would spread rather than rise. I made hundreds of choux before achieving consistent results. Laminated doughs represented another level of difficulty entirely. Croissant dough required incorporating a butter block into yeasted dough, then folding and rolling repeatedly to create hundreds of alternating layers of butter and dough. When baked properly, water in the butter created steam that separated the layers, producing flaky pastry that shattered delicately when bitten. The process was physically demanding and technically precise. The butter block had to be rolled to exact thickness and remain pliable but cold. The dough needed proper gluten development but not overworking. Each fold had to be executed smoothly with even rolling and perfect 90-degree angles. Temperature control was critical throughout. Too warm and the butter melted into the dough rather than staying distinct. Too cold and the butter broke into chunks rather than rolling smoothly. I spent 3 months practicing croissant technique at École Ferrandi, making batch after batch, learning through mistakes and corrections. My first attempts were disasters. Butter broke through the dough surface, layers were thick and doughy rather than thin and crisp, shapes were irregular. Chef Dubois would inspect each batch critically, pointing out problems. "Your lamination is uneven here, you can see thick dough layers alternating with thin. Your rolling pressure must be absolutely consistent. Start again." Gradually, through repetition and attention to detail, I learned to feel when the dough was at the right consistency, to judge butter pliability by touch, to recognize proper proofing by appearance and gentle pressure. My croissants began emerging from the oven properly: golden exterior, distinct flaky layers, tender interior with proper honeycomb structure, buttery flavor without greasiness. Macaron production became one of my obsessions at École Ferrandi. The delicate almond meringue cookies with perfect smooth tops, ruffled feet, and tender chewy interiors were technically demanding and unforgiving of mistakes. The meringue had to be aged properly, beaten to exact stiffness, folded with almond flour and sugar to precise consistency. Too much folding deflated the meringue, too little left it stiff and didn't develop proper macaronage texture. Piping required absolute consistency. Each shell needed identical size and shape. The batter had to settle into smooth circles without peaks. The shells needed to develop proper skin before baking so feet would form correctly. Baking temperature and timing were critical. Too hot and shells cracked, too cool and they didn't develop proper texture. Humidity affected everything. Some days, no matter how perfect the technique, macarons would be difficult because atmospheric conditions weren't ideal. I made macarons at least weekly for a year at École Ferrandi, perfecting the technique, learning to troubleshoot problems, understanding how ingredient ratios affected texture. By my second year, I could produce consistent macarons reliably. Smooth-topped, properly footed, with the characteristic crisp shell giving way to chewy interior. That foundation later allowed me to develop my signature flavors and push the boundaries of traditional macaron making. Entremet composition represented the pinnacle of French pastry technique, combining multiple components into elaborate plated desserts or celebration cakes. A single entremet might include Genoise sponge, flavored syrups, mousse layers, crémeaux, crunchy elements, mirror glazes, and decorative components. Each element needed to be technically perfect individually and harmonious together. I learned to make perfect genoise, the delicate sponge that formed the foundation for many French cakes. Genoise required carefully folding flour into whipped eggs and melted butter without deflating the egg foam. The batter had to be mixed just enough to incorporate ingredients while maintaining maximum airiness. Overbaked genoise was dry and crumbly, underbaked was gummy. The texture needed to be light, tender, and moist enough to absorb flavored syrups without falling apart. Mousse preparation required understanding of protein structure, air incorporation, and temperature control. Chocolate mousse needed properly tempered chocolate folded into Italian meringue with whipped cream for silky, airy texture that was stable enough to slice cleanly. Fruit mousses required balancing fruit puree with gelatin, dairy, and air to achieve proper consistency without being too firm or too loose. During my second year at École Ferrandi, I had the extraordinary opportunity to stage at Pierre Hermé's patisserie, one of the most famous pastry destinations in the entire world. Hermé was known internationally as the Picasso of pastry, famous not just for technical excellence but for revolutionary flavor combinations and artistic innovation that pushed pastry boundaries. Working in his laboratory, even as an unpaid intern doing the most basic prep work, was an immense privilege that few students received. The stage was grueling beyond anything I'd experienced. I worked 14 to 15-hour days, 6 days per week, for no pay. My day started at 5 a.m. when I arrived at the laboratory to begin morning prep. I did the most repetitive, basic tasks. Measuring ingredients precisely according to formulas, piping hundreds of macaron shells onto silicone mats in perfectly even rows, filling chocolate molds with tempered chocolate, assembling components that more senior pastry chefs had created. The hierarchy in Hermé's laboratory was absolute and strictly observed. As the lowliest stage, the newest person in the kitchen, I rarely spoke unless directly addressed by a superior. I never offered opinions or suggestions. I simply observed, learned, executed assigned tasks with absolute precision, and tried desperately to avoid mistakes that would get me dismissed immediately. Many stages were dismissed within their first week for failing to meet standards or showing insufficient dedication. But what I learned during those months was invaluable and worth every difficult hour. I watched pastry chefs work with a level of precision and technical mastery I'd never imagined possible even after my École Ferrandi training. Every macaron shell was identical to micrometer precision, every chocolate perfectly tempered with glossy snap and proper crystalline structure, every entremet element executed with absolute technical perfection. Nothing left the laboratory that wasn't flawless. I learned that world-class pastry wasn't just about having recipes, it was about technique perfected through tens of thousands of repetitions until movements became unconscious muscle memory. It was about understanding ingredients so deeply you could predict exactly how they'd behave under different conditions. It was about consistency that required absolute focus and discipline every single day, regardless of fatigue or distraction. I learned about flavor composition and combination by watching how Hermé worked, observing his creative process, seeing how he tested new flavor pairings. He combined unexpected elements that theoretically shouldn't work but in practice created brilliant harmonies. Rose with raspberry, floral perfume enhancing tart fruit, olive oil with mandarin, fatty richness balancing bright citrus, black sesame with yuzu, nutty earthiness meeting Japanese citrus, passion fruit with chocolate, tropical acidity cutting sweet richness. He taught, through example and occasional brief comments, that innovation required understanding classical technique perfectly first, then thoughtfully breaking specific rules for deliberate purposes, not random experimentation. You couldn't improvise successfully without mastering fundamentals completely. His revolutionary flavor combinations worked because they were built on flawless technical execution and deep understanding of how flavors interacted. Most valuably, I learned from watching Hermé himself work occasionally in the laboratory. He'd visit regularly, tasting products in development, offering corrections with minimal words but maximum impact. His feedback was always precise and actionable. This needs 8% more sugar in the Italian meringue for proper stability. Or, the passion fruit cremo is slightly too acidic, balance it with 2 more grams of butter per kilogram. Once, he tasted a batch of passion fruit cremo I'd helped a senior pastry chef prepare for a new entremet composition we were developing. He took a small spoonful, closed his eyes, considered thoughtfully for several seconds. This needs 2 grams less gelatin per kilogram of total preparation, he said quietly but firmly. Currently it's slightly too firm for the texture contrast we want with the chocolate mousse layers beneath and the crisp chocolate decorations above. The cremo needs to be just barely set, almost fluid, so all 3 elements create perfect textural progression. His palate and technical understanding were so refined he could detect texture differences measured in grams, could predict how components would work together in a complete composition, could envision final results from tasting raw preparations. That level of mastery, that depth of understanding, became my aspiration and professional goal. After completing École Ferrandi with honors and my stage at Pierre Hermé's, I returned to America ready to work professionally. I moved to New York City at 26, knowing it had America's most sophisticated pastry scene and most demanding customers. I started as a pastry cook at a well-regarded French restaurant in the Upper East Side, working the dessert station. It was humbling after my training, being the newest member of the pastry team. But I knew I needed to prove myself in the fast-paced environment of New York restaurant service. Working desserts in a busy fine dining restaurant was intense. During peak service, we'd plate 60 desserts per hour, with orders constantly printing, every dessert needing to be composed precisely and beautifully while maintaining speed. The physical demands were brutal. Standing in the small pastry station for hours, the precision required to plate identically while rushing, the mental focus needed to track multiple dessert orders simultaneously. But I loved the challenge and the adrenaline. I loved the satisfaction of perfectly plating a complex dessert while under pressure, of seeing diners' faces when beautiful desserts arrived at tables. Over the next 3 years, I worked my way up through New York's pastry kitchens. I moved from the French restaurant to a modern American restaurant with an innovative pastry program, then to a hotel with a large pastry team serving multiple outlets. I became assistant pastry chef, then pastry sous chef, learning not just technique but leadership, production planning, and the business aspects of running professional pastry operations. During these years, I also began developing my personal pastry style. On days off, I'd experiment at home, creating desserts that merged classical French technique with American flavors and modern presentations. I developed a signature macaron with unexpected flavors: raspberry rose that combined tart fruit with floral perfume, salted caramel chocolate that played with sweet and salty contrasts, lemon thyme that brought herbal notes to citrus. I also became obsessed with viennoiserie, the category of laminated yeasted pastries that included croissants, pain au chocolat, and Queen Amman. Perfect viennoiserie was technically demanding, requiring understanding of both bread baking and pastry lamination. I spent months perfecting croissant technique, the dough hydration, the butter selection, the lamination process, the proofing conditions, the baking temperatures. I tested dozens of variables, documenting every batch, learning through trial and error. By age 30, I was ready to become a pastry chef with full creative control. I started interviewing for head pastry positions at new restaurant and bakery openings. That's when I met Christopher Bennett at a specialty food industry event in Manhattan. Christopher was 40, charismatic, a successful bakery owner who'd opened several commercial bakeries supplying bread and pastries to restaurants and hotels. He told me he wanted to open a high-end retail patisserie targeting serious pastry enthusiasts and wholesale clients who wanted French-quality products, and he needed a talented pastry chef to develop the creative vision while he handled business operations. We met several times to discuss the opportunity. Christopher presented himself as someone who understood the pastry business but needed a chef with serious French training to create products that could compete with the best patisseries. He was enthusiastic about my École Ferrandi training and my stage at Pierre Hermé. He said he wanted to create something genuinely excellent, not just another Manhattan bakery, but a destination known for exceptional French pastry. The arrangement seemed ideal. I'd be head pastry chef with complete creative control over product development, recipes, and production. Christopher would handle business operations, wholesale client relationships, and retail management. We'd split ownership, with me having substantial equity in exchange for my pastry expertise and recipe development. On paper, it was perfect, my pastry skills combined with his business experience. We signed partnership agreements and began preparing to open the patisserie. Christopher secured a beautiful storefront in Soho with space for a retail shop in front and a full pastry kitchen in back. I began developing the opening menu, a focused selection of French pastries and desserts that showcased classical technique and quality ingredients. The development process was creatively fulfilling. I created products that represented my training and style, technically perfect French pastries made with exceptional ingredients. My signature croissants used cultured butter from a small Vermont dairy, laminated with my precise technique for maximum flakiness. My macarons featured unexpected flavor combinations I'd developed over years. My entremets were elaborate, multi-component modern French desserts that demonstrated advanced technique. Each product required extensive testing. Croissants alone took 3 months to perfect, testing different flours, butter sources, hydration levels, lamination methods, proofing conditions, and baking temperatures. I documented everything in detailed recipe notebooks with dated entries showing each iteration and what I'd learned. I also developed a signature Queen Amman, the bread and pastry that combined croissant dough with caramelized sugar for crispy, buttery deliciousness. Mine featured salted caramel folded into the layers, creating pockets of sweet salty richness. The technique was demanding. The sugar had to caramelize during baking without burning, the layers had to stay distinct, the bottom needed to crisp while the interior stayed tender. After 2 months of testing, I achieved perfect results consistently. For special occasion desserts, I created elaborate entremets like my chocolate passion fruit composition, layers of chocolate sponge, passion fruit crémeaux, chocolate mousse, and mirror glaze. The dessert required precision at every stage. Perfectly baked genoise, properly set crémeaux with ideal acidity, airy mousse with intense chocolate flavor, glossy mirror glaze with exact consistency. Each component needed to be excellent individually and harmonious together. Christopher observed my development process with apparent interest. He'd taste products, offer feedback mostly about costs and production efficiency, and express enthusiasm about the menu's potential. He seemed content to let me handle all pastry decisions while he focused on business operations, rent negotiations, equipment purchasing, and supplier contracts. We opened the patisserie 10 months after forming our partnership. The shop was beautiful, elegant French-inspired design, glass cases displaying pastries, open kitchen windows where customers could watch us work. My team included 2 talented pastry assistants I'd recruited, both École Ferrandi graduates who understood French technique and my standards. Opening day was thrilling. The cases filled with my croissants, pains au chocolat, Queen Amman, macarons in jewel-like rows, eclairs, tarts, and entremets. Customers lined up before we opened, drawn by pre-opening social media buzz. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People praised the croissant's flakiness, the macarons' perfect texture and creative flavors, the beauty and flavor of the desserts. Early reviews were excellent. Food bloggers called my croissants the best in Manhattan, and my macarons Pierre Hermé quality. Eater published a feature about the patisserie, highlighting my French training and signature products. Manhattan Magazine included us in their Best New Bakeries list. Business grew rapidly, with morning croissant lines and special orders for entremets weeks in advance. But I soon noticed troubling patterns. During important tastings with potential wholesale clients, hotels, restaurants, cafes interested in purchasing our products, Christopher would position himself as the master pâtissier despite having no pastry training. He'd describe products using the first person. I developed these croissants to showcase cultured butter, or, my Queen Amman technique creates exceptional caramelization. The first major theft incident happened 5 months after opening when Christopher scheduled a tasting for a luxury hotel group considering placing large weekly orders. He asked me to prepare sample platters of our products, which I did beautifully, assuming I'd be presenting them and explaining the techniques and quality standards. Instead, Christopher kept me in the back kitchen while he presented everything himself to the hotel purchasing directors. I could hear him through the doorway, describing my croissants as pastries I perfected through years of training in Paris. That was a complete lie. Christopher had never trained in Paris or anywhere else in pastry. He couldn't properly laminate dough if his life depended on it. He presented my Queen Amman as my signature pastry, combining traditional Breton technique with my innovation of salted caramel incorporation. Every word was fraudulent. I'd developed that pastry over 2 months of testing. The salted caramel innovation was my idea, the technique was mine. He'd merely tasted the finished product and approved it for the menu. The hotel directors were impressed, praising Christopher's pastry expertise. They placed an order for $500 weekly of croissants and pastries. When I congratulated him later, mentioning I wished I could have explained the quality standards we maintained, he waved dismissively. "Clients want to hear from the business owner, not the pastry chef," he said. That's just how wholesale works. The second major incident occurred when Food and Wine magazine contacted us about featuring our patisserie in their annual pastry issue. Christopher did the interview without telling me, then the published article attributed all creative credit to him. Pastry chef Christopher Bennett's croissants showcase his classical training in Paris, the article read. Bennett's innovative Queen Amman with salted caramel demonstrates his creative approach to traditional French pastries. His macarons, featuring unexpected flavor combinations, reflect his time working with renowned pâtissiers in France. Every single attribution was false. Christopher hadn't trained in Paris, hadn't worked with any pâtissiers, and certainly hadn't created any of those products. The article praised him for my work, my training, my creative innovations. Readers would believe Christopher was the talented pastry chef when he literally couldn't make a proper macaron if someone gave him detailed instructions. When I confronted him, he dismissed my concerns. "The article is great publicity," he said. "Our retail sales increased 20% since it published. This benefits both of us. You're too focused on individual credit instead of appreciating business success. But the article attributes my pastries to you," I responded, frustrated. "It says you trained in Paris and worked with renowned pâtissiers." "None of that is true. You need to contact the magazine and issue a correction." Christopher laughed. "No magazine will print corrections about who created pastries. That's not how food media works. Focus on making excellent products. Let me handle publicity. That's what I'm good at." The third major incident happened when Christopher announced he was publishing a pastry cookbook. I was initially supportive, assuming it would be a collaborative project featuring our patisserie's recipes with proper attribution. Instead, I learned he was publishing the book under his name alone, with my recipes presented as his creations. "You can't publish my recipes as yours," I told him firmly. "Those are my creative work. I developed every recipe in this patisserie. If you want to publish a cookbook, it should list both of us as authors or clearly state I'm the pastry chef who created the recipes." Christopher's response was infuriating. "The recipes belong to the business, which I own the majority stake in. I can publish them however I want. You're an employee with equity, Isabella. Employees don't own the company's intellectual property. I'm a partner, not an employee," I countered, barely controlling my anger. "And recipes I developed before our partnership or during it are my creative work. You cannot publish my Queen Amman recipe, my croissant technique, my macaron flavors under your name. That's theft. Talk to your lawyer if you want," he said dismissively. "But you'll find I'm right legally. Focus on the kitchen and stop interfering with business decisions." The fourth major incident occurred when I was selected as a finalist for the James Beard Foundation's Outstanding Pastry Chef Award, one of the highest honors in American pastry. The nomination recognized my macarons, specifically my raspberry rose and chocolate passion fruit flavors that demonstrated technical mastery and creative innovation. Instead of being thrilled for me, Christopher immediately began positioning himself to take credit. He contacted food media announcing our James Beard nomination, using plural pronouns as if he were being recognized. He gave interviews describing my approach to macaron flavors and my philosophy of combining traditional French technique with creative innovation. When the James Beard Foundation published the finalist profiles, Christopher had somehow inserted himself into my story. The write-up mentioned the partnership of Christopher Bennett and Isabel Morrison, with Bennett's classical training and Morrison's production expertise creating award-worthy pastries. It was completely backward. I had the classical training, Christopher had no pastry training. I was the creator, he was just the business owner. The fifth and final major incident before my eventual confrontation happened when Serious Eats published a long-form feature titled, Christopher Bennett, the American Pâtissier Bringing French Excellence to New York. The article positioned Christopher as a self-taught pastry genius, described his signature products in detail with recipes and techniques, and included a sidebar about Chef Bennett's pastry philosophy, using words and concepts I'd shared during our product development. The piece featured my exact croissant technique with specific butter percentages, fold counts, and proofing temperatures. My Queen Amman method with detailed caramelization technique. My macaron recipes with my signature flavor combinations. All presented as Christopher's creative work, his technical knowledge, his innovations. Reading that article, seeing my years of training and development attributed to someone who couldn't properly whip cream to stiff peaks, was professionally devastating. The article would establish Christopher's false reputation permanently in food media. Future features, cookbook publishers, and competition judges would cite this as proof Christopher was the pastry talent. By that point, I'd started systematically documenting everything with the understanding I'd eventually need comprehensive evidence. Every morning, I photographed my work with timestamps. I kept 3 identical recipe notebooks with dated entries showing every product development iteration. I cultivated direct relationships with wholesale clients, ensuring they knew I was the pastry chef creating their products. I saved every private message from food critics and competition judges. When the James Beard judges contacted me directly to discuss my macaron development process, I responded with detailed explanations of my technique evolution, then forwarded everything to my personal email for documentation. Most importantly, I built strong relationships with my pastry assistants and made sure they understood what was happening. Marie and Sophie, both talented pâtissières who'd trained in France, watched Christopher steal credit repeatedly. They agreed to provide written testimony when needed. For 2 years, while Christopher stole credit for my present work, I documented my future. When the time came to act, I had everything. Recipe notebooks proving I'd created every product, time-stamped photographs showing development, wholesale client relationships, competition entries, pastry assistant testimony, and legal opinions confirming Christopher had violated our partnership. I chose the James Beard Foundation pastry competition to confront him publicly. As a finalist, I'd be competing live before judges and industry figures. Christopher planned to attend, naturally positioning himself to take credit if I won. The timing was perfect. The entire pastry community would witness the truth simultaneously. The competition morning arrived. I prepared my signature raspberry rose macarons, demonstrating every technical element: perfect meringue, precise piping, ideal foot development, smooth shells, and the creative filling I'd spent months perfecting. Christopher stood in the audience, already accepting congratulations from people who believed he'd created the recipe. After presenting my macarons to the judges, I asked for a moment to make a statement. The head judge, surprised but curious, agreed. I stood at the competition podium with my attorney beside me, my recipe notebooks stacked in front of me, and began speaking clearly so everyone in the hall could hear. "These raspberry rose macarons represent 2 years of my creative work," I said. "I developed this recipe, this technique, this flavor combination. Not my business partner Christopher Bennett, though he's claimed credit for my work repeatedly. I have comprehensive documentation proving every product in our patisserie is my creation, not his." The room went silent. Christopher's face paled. I opened my notebooks, holding up dated entries showing my macaron development. "Here's my recipe evolution from 16 months ago, showing 40 iterations before achieving the perfect ratio of raspberry to rose. Here are photographs timestamped before Christopher ever tasted this macaron. Here's the competition entry form I filed listing myself as creator." My attorney stepped forward with official-looking binders. "Ms. Morrison has documentation proving she created every pastry Mr. Bennett has claimed as his work. Dated recipe notebooks, supplier invoices in her name, testimony from pastry assistants, private communications with judges and critics. All proving Mr. Bennett has systematically stolen credit for her pastries." Marie and Sophie, my assistants, stood from the audience. "We'll testify," Marie said clearly. "We've watched Christopher claim credit for Bella's work for 2 years. Every recipe, every technique, she created them. He can barely make a proper genoise." The James Beard judges looked shocked. The head judge made notes. Several prominent pastry chefs in the audience started whispering, some pulling out phones to document this. Christopher tried to leave but found himself surrounded by people with questions. The confrontation effectively destroyed Christopher's reputation instantly. Within hours, food media was reporting the story. Within days, wholesale clients were transferring their business to me. Within weeks, Christopher's name became synonymous with fraud in the pastry community. 3 months later, I opened my own patisserie, Maison Bella, with investment from supporters who'd seen the James Beard confrontation. The shop was intimate and elegant, focused entirely on my French pastries. All my wholesale clients followed me. The pastry community rallied around me. Within a year, I won the James Beard Outstanding Pastry Chef Award. My acceptance speech thanked everyone who'd supported me and reminded the industry that proper credit matters. 2 years later, I published a cookbook, under my own name, that became a bestseller. My croissants were named Manhattan's Best by multiple publications, all correctly credited to me. Christopher's bakery closed within 18 months of my departure. His reputation was destroyed. No serious wholesale clients would work with him. No pastry chefs would join his team. His name became a cautionary tale about stealing creative credit. That's what happens when systematic recipe theft meets someone skilled enough to succeed independently and determined enough to expose the truth publicly. Christopher Bennett destroyed his career through his own dishonesty. I built a successful patisserie on pastries I actually created, protected by clear documentation and loyalty from those who knew the truth. The truth came out, and justice was served. Revenge. After completing École Ferrandi with honors and my transformative stage at Pierre Hermé's laboratory, I returned to America at 26, ready to work professionally as a trained pâtissière. I moved to New York City, knowing it had America's most sophisticated pastry scene, most discerning customers, and greatest opportunities for serious pastry work. I started as a pastry cook at a well-regarded French restaurant in the Upper East Side, working the dessert station under an experienced pastry chef. It was humbling after all my training, being the newest and lowest-ranking member of the pastry team. But I knew I needed to prove myself in the demanding environment of New York restaurant service and learn how American restaurants operated differently from French patisseries. Working desserts in a busy fine dining restaurant was intensely different from pastry shop production. During peak service, we'd plate 60 to 80 desserts per hour, with orders constantly printing from the dining room, every dessert needing to be composed precisely and beautifully while maintaining speed and handling multiple orders simultaneously. The physical demands were brutal and exhausting. Standing in the cramped pastry station for 5 to 6 hours straight during service, the precision required to plate identically perfect desserts while rushing against time, The mental focus needed to track multiple dessert orders simultaneously while coordinating timing with the savory kitchen. But I loved the challenge and the adrenaline rush. I loved the satisfaction of perfectly plating a complex multi-component dessert while under intense pressure, of seeing diners' faces light up when beautiful desserts arrived at their tables. Over the next 3 years, I worked my way up through New York's competitive pastry kitchens, building my reputation and skills. I moved from the French restaurant to a modern American restaurant in Greenwich Village with an innovative pastry program, then to a major hotel with a large pastry team serving multiple restaurant outlets, room service, banquet events, and a retail pastry shop. I became assistant pastry chef, then pastry sous chef, learning not just technique but leadership, production planning, inventory management, and the business aspects of running professional pastry operations at scale. During these years working in New York kitchens, I also began seriously developing my personal pastry style and signature products. On my rare days off, I'd experiment in my small apartment kitchen, creating desserts that merged classical French technique I'd learned with American flavors and modern presentations. I developed signature macarons with unexpected flavor combinations that went beyond traditional French fillings. Raspberry rose that combined tart fruit puree with delicate floral perfume, salted caramel chocolate that played sophisticated sweet-salty contrasts, lemon thyme that brought herbal aromatics to bright citrus. Each macaron flavor required weeks of testing to achieve perfect balance. The raspberry rose needed enough rose water to perfume the buttercream without becoming soapy or overwhelming the fresh raspberry flavor. The salted caramel required precise salt levels that enhanced sweetness without being detectably salty. The lemon thyme needed fresh thyme infused into Italian meringue buttercream at specific temperatures to extract herbal oils without bitterness, balanced against lemon curd made tart enough to cut the buttercream richness. I also became obsessed with viennoiserie, the category of laminated yeasted pastries that included croissants, pain au chocolat, and queen amane. Perfect viennoiserie was exceptionally technically demanding, requiring deep understanding of both bread baking with yeast fermentation and pastry lamination with butter layers. I spent months on my days off perfecting croissant technique, testing dough hydration levels, comparing butter sources, refining lamination processes, adjusting proofing conditions, experimenting with baking temperatures and times. I tested literally dozens of variables systematically, documenting every single batch in detailed notebooks. I tried different flour brands and protein levels. I sourced butter from multiple dairies, comparing flavor and lamination properties. I tested various hydration levels to find the optimal balance between dough strength and tenderness. I experimented with fold numbers and methods. I tried different proofing temperatures and times. I baked at various oven temperatures with different steam levels. Through this methodical testing over many months, I gradually developed a croissant technique that produced consistently excellent results. Flaky exterior shattering delicately, interior with perfect honeycomb structure showing distinct layers, rich buttery flavor without greasiness, tender texture that wasn't doughy. The technique was reproducible, which meant I could train others to achieve the same results following my specific parameters. My testing also led me to discover a Vermont dairy producing exceptional cultured butter that worked beautifully for lamination. The butter had slightly higher fat content than standard, cultured flavor that added complexity, and perfect plasticity that remained workable when cold. The dairy was small and charged premium prices, but the quality difference in final croissants was undeniable and worth the cost for serious pastry work. By age 30, after 3 years working my way up through New York kitchens, I was ready professionally and creatively for the next step. Becoming a head pastry chef with complete creative control over a menu and full authority to implement my vision. I started actively interviewing for executive pastry chef positions at new restaurant and bakery openings throughout Manhattan. That's when I met Christopher Bennett at a Specialty Food Association industry event, a large trade show where food producers, restaurateurs, and buyers connected. Christopher was 40, confident and charismatic, a successful businessman who'd opened several commercial bakeries that supplied bread and basic pastries to restaurants, hotels, and cafes throughout the city. His existing businesses were profitable but focused on volume production of standard products rather than artisanal quality. He approached me after hearing me speak on a panel about French pastry training and modern American pastry trends. He said he'd been impressed by my comments about classical technique and ingredient quality, that he'd researched my background afterward and learned about my École Ferrandi training and stage at Pierre Hermé's laboratory. He told me he wanted to pivot from his commercial bakery operations into high-end retail patisserie targeting serious pastry enthusiasts and discerning wholesale clients who wanted French-quality products. We met several more times over the following weeks to discuss the opportunity in depth. Christopher presented himself as someone who understood the business side of pastry operations, real estate, equipment, suppliers, wholesale relationships, retail management, but needed a talented pastry chef with serious French credentials to develop the creative vision and lead actual production. He was enthusiastically complimentary about my training background and portfolio of signature products I'd developed. He said he wanted to create something genuinely excellent and distinctive, not just another Manhattan bakery producing competent but unremarkable pastries. He talked about wanting a destination patisserie that could compete with the best French shops, that could earn recognition from food media and serious pastry enthusiasts, that could supply the city's best restaurants and hotels with products they currently couldn't find locally. The arrangement he proposed seemed ideal for my professional goals. I'd be head pastry chef and creative director with complete authority over all product development, recipe creation, production methods, and quality standards. Christopher would handle all business operations, securing and negotiating the retail space lease, purchasing equipment, managing finances and accounting, developing wholesale client relationships, hiring and managing front-of-house staff, handling marketing and publicity. We'd split ownership equity, with me receiving substantial stake in exchange for my pastry expertise, recipe development, and creative leadership. My compensation would include competitive salary plus significant equity that would become very valuable if the business succeeded as Christopher projected. On paper, it was perfect, combining my pastry skills and creative vision with his business experience and operational management. We signed detailed partnership agreements and began preparing to open the patisserie together. Christopher secured a beautiful storefront location in Soho with excellent foot traffic, high ceilings, and enough square footage for a retail shop in front displaying pastries in elegant glass cases and a full professional pastry kitchen in the back with all necessary equipment. I began the exciting creative work of developing our opening menu, creating a focused selection of French pastries and desserts that showcased classical technique executed with exceptional ingredients. The development process was creatively fulfilling and professionally exciting, representing everything I'd trained for over years in France and America. I created products that represented my entire pastry journey and personal style, technically perfect French pastries made with the highest quality ingredients I could source, classical methods I'd learned combined with creative touches that made them distinctively mine. My signature croissants became the foundation of our morning offerings. I used my precisely developed technique perfected through years of testing, specific flour blend for ideal gluten structure, the exceptional Vermont cultured butter I'd discovered, exact hydration levels I'd determined through experimentation, my proven lamination method with specific fold counts and resting times, carefully controlled proofing conditions, and optimal baking temperatures. The result was croissants that rivaled anything available in Manhattan. Deeply golden exteriors that shattered delicately, perfect honeycomb interiors with distinct visible layers, rich buttery flavor from the cultured butter, tender texture without any doughiness. Each batch of croissants took 3 full days from start to finish, requiring precision at every stage. Day 1 involved mixing and developing the détrempe dough base, letting it rest properly for gluten relaxation. Day 2 was lamination day, incorporating the butter block and executing the folds with resting periods between. Day 3 involved final shaping, careful proofing at controlled temperature and humidity, and baking in preheated ovens at specific temperatures with proper steam. There were no shortcuts. Proper croissants demanded time, technique, and attention to detail. I also developed my signature Queen Amman, taking the traditional bread and pastry and elevating it with my personal touch. Queen Amman combined croissant-style laminated dough with generous amounts of sugar that caramelized during baking, creating crispy exteriors with tender buttery interiors. Mine featured salted caramel folded into the layers along with traditional sugar, creating pockets of sweet salty richness throughout. The technique was demanding. The sugar had to caramelize properly without burning, the layers had to stay distinct despite the liquid caramel. The bottom needed perfect crispness while the interior remained tender. After 2 full months of testing different approaches, I achieved consistent perfect results. The Queen Amman emerged from the oven deeply caramelized with crispy bottoms, distinct flaky layers visible in cross-section, and pockets of salted caramel that provided sophisticated flavor contrasts. They needed to be eaten within hours of baking while the caramelized sugar remained crisp, which meant we'd make fresh batches throughout the day. For macarons, I created my signature flavor combinations that I'd developed over years: raspberry rose, salted caramel chocolate, lemon thyme, passion fruit vanilla, pistachio cherry, and chocolate hazelnut. Each flavor required precise Italian meringue buttercream properly balanced with fruit purees, infusions, or chocolate ganaches. The shells needed to be perfect: smooth tops, ruffled feet, tender chewy texture that wasn't too soft or too firm. Macaron production was technically demanding and intolerant of mistakes or imprecision. The Italian meringue needed to be beaten to exact stiffness and temperature. The macaronage folding technique required specific counts and consistency. Piping had to be absolutely uniform. The shells needed proper resting to develop skin before baking. Oven temperature and timing were critical. Humidity affected everything unpredictably. Some days were simply bad macaron days regardless of technique perfection. For special occasion desserts and wholesale clients needing sophisticated plated desserts, I created elaborate entremets like my chocolate passion fruit composition that combined multiple expertly executed components. Layers of chocolate genoise soaked with passion fruit syrup, passion fruit cremo with bright tropical acidity, chocolate mousse made with high-quality Venezuelan chocolate, and mirror glaze providing glossy professional finish. Each component needed to be excellent individually while creating harmonious whole when combined. Christopher observed my entire development process over the months of preparation, attending tastings and offering feedback. His comments were mostly about business considerations: food costs, production time efficiency, retail pricing strategies, wholesale margins. He seemed content and even enthusiastic about letting me handle all culinary decisions while he focused on business operations, lease negotiations, equipment purchasing, supplier contracts, and hiring front-of-house retail staff. We opened the patisserie 10 months after forming our partnership, after extensive preparation and testing to ensure everything was ready. The retail shop was beautiful, elegant French-inspired interior design with soft lighting, comfortable seating area for customers enjoying pastries with coffee, glass display cases showing products attractively, and open kitchen windows where customers could watch us working and see the pastry production happening. My pastry team included 2 talented assistants I'd recruited, both École Ferrandi graduates named Marie and Sophie who understood classical French technique and shared my standards for precision and quality. Opening day was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. The display cases filled with my croissants still warm from final baking, golden pains au chocolat with visible chocolate batons, Queen Amman glistening with caramelized sugar, rows of colorful macarons arranged like jewels, glossy eclairs filled with vanilla pastry cream, fruit tarts with perfectly arranged berries, and elaborate entremets showcasing my technical skills. Customers began lining up before we officially opened, drawn by pre-opening social media buzz and food blogger coverage. The response was overwhelmingly positive and gratifying beyond my hopes. People praised the croissants' exceptional flakiness and buttery flavor, comparing them favorably to Parisian standards. They called the Queen a man, revelatory, and the best in New York. The macarons were described as Pierre Hermé quality, with perfect texture and creative sophisticated flavors. The entremets were photographed extensively and shared on social media. Lines formed every morning for croissants and continued throughout the day. Early professional reviews were excellent and helped establish our reputation quickly. Food bloggers wrote enthusiastically about discovering authentic French pastry quality in Manhattan. Eater published a feature article highlighting my École Ferrandi training, my stage at Pierre Hermé's, and the signature products I'd developed. Manhattan Magazine included us in their Best New Bakeries annual list. Serious Eats praised the technical excellence and ingredient quality. Business grew rapidly, with morning croissant lines becoming routine and special orders for entremets and celebration cakes booked weeks in advance. But within months, I noticed troubling patterns emerging that made me increasingly concerned and suspicious about Christopher's integrity and honesty. During important tastings with potential wholesale clients, luxury hotels, fine dining restaurants, upscale cafes interested in purchasing our croissants and pastries for their operations, Christopher would position himself as the master pâtissier and creative genius despite having absolutely no pastry training or technical knowledge whatsoever. He'd describe products using first-person possessive language. I developed these croissants to showcase the exceptional cultured butter I source from Vermont, or my Queen Amman technique creates the perfect caramelization while maintaining flaky layers, or I created these macaron flavors during my training in Paris. Every word was fraudulent misrepresentation. Christopher had never trained in Paris or anywhere else in pastry. He literally couldn't properly laminate dough to save his life. The theft of credit intensified systematically and deliberately over the following months, becoming increasingly brazen and comprehensive. Christopher started giving interviews to food publications where he'd describe his culinary vision, his signature techniques, and his creative innovations, presenting my pastry work and creative development as his own genius. Food writers and critics naturally assumed the bakery owner was the pastry talent, especially since I was usually too busy actually producing pastries to participate in publicity and media appearances. But I began fighting back quietly, systematically documenting everything while building my exit strategy and gathering the evidence I'd eventually need. Every morning before Christopher arrived, I photographed my work with timestamps showing dates and times. I kept 3 identical recipe notebooks with dated entries showing every product development iteration and technique refinement. I cultivated direct personal relationships with wholesale clients, ensuring they knew I was the actual pastry chef creating their products and managing quality standards. I saved every single private message and email from food critics, competition judges, and industry professionals. When James Beard Foundation judges contacted me directly to discuss my macaron development process for the pastry competition, I responded with detailed explanations of my technique evolution over years, then immediately forwarded everything to my personal email account for permanent documentation outside Christopher's potential access or control. Most importantly and strategically, I built strong relationships with my pastry assistants Marie and Sophie, making sure they fully understood what was happening and would support me when needed. Both were talented French-trained pâtissières who watched Christopher steal credit repeatedly during wholesale client meetings and media interviews. They found his fraud professionally offensive and morally wrong. They agreed readily to provide detailed written testimony when the time came to expose the truth publicly. For 2 full years, while Christopher systematically stole credit for my present work and built his fraudulent reputation, I meticulously documented my future vindication. When the time finally came to act decisively, I had everything needed: comprehensive recipe notebooks proving I'd created every single product, timestamped photographs showing development processes, established wholesale client relationships and loyalty, competition entries listing my work, pastry assistant testimony, and legal opinions from attorneys specializing in partnership law confirming Christopher had violated our partnership agreement through systematic fraud and misrepresentation. The James Beard Foundation pastry competition provided the perfect opportunity and setting for public confrontation. As a finalist competing for Outstanding Pastry Chef recognition, I'd be presenting my signature raspberry rose macarons live before judges, industry leaders, and assembled pastry professionals. Christopher naturally planned to attend, already positioning himself to take credit if I won. The timing was strategically perfect. The entire pastry community would witness the truth simultaneously, making it impossible for Christopher to control the narrative or spin the revelation favorably afterward.